far away, put a hand up, ask any questions you like, and I'll try and identify it. No questions?
Excellent.
All right. Alan?
I was just asking about tagging technology generally and whether it really is moving forward at the pace you need it to be.
The tags continue to get smaller and smaller, and more intelligent is the best way to describe them every year. The different manufacturers are all bringing out new technologies. Last year we trialled some that had a predator tab that told us if the tag inside a fish had been eaten by a predator. And they go on and they're developing. It's at a fast rate of knots, but we need it to be faster, and we need to keep pushing the manufacturers to both develop the technology and produce it at a price that we can all afford to roll out this size of project.
Do you want to just say what the cost of those tags is?
A normal tag, acoustic V7 tag, is about £200. The predator tags are about £600 plus.
But
slightly earlier on, somebody told me about the efforts that are being made by the Norwegian government to sort out their salmon farms. We've heard nothing about what the Norwegians are up to at this symposium. I wondered if somebody would like to comment.
Yeah, I'll have a go at that. Having just seen their plan for the next 5 years. The Norwegians are slightly, not peculiar, they're slightly controversial. I think the government admit there's an issue with aquaculture, that it is impacting. Funnily enough, their biggest impact is from genetic integration in their rivers. And they obviously have lice issues too. From an NGO point of view, we have issues with the Norwegian policy because you may have heard of a traffic light system. And the traffic light system is that they monitor their wild fish, the mortality of wild fish from aquaculture. And from 0 to 10% wild fish smolt deaths, the farms can slightly increase their biomass. From 10 to 30% wild fish mortality, 30% wild smolt mortality, they have to keep the biomass the same. And it's only when they reach 30% that that regulation kicks in and they have to reduce their biomass. And from an NGO point of view, that is just totally unacceptable. You cannot, in all conscience, go into a natural environment and have a government policy that is prepared to see 30% of smolts killed before you do anything about it. So, you know, aquaculture it's not just Scotland, it's an international problem. Canada, Ireland, Norway and Scotland have commercial fish farming industries with wild salmon. The Faroes, who have probably the best regulation, have no wild salmon of their own, but they have very good regulation. The one thing we found is that regulation tends to be to protect the welfare of the fish in the cages. You heard from Bill today. What we're looking for right across the North Atlantic, not just in Scotland, is for the protection of wild fish from the impacts of aquaculture. So I hope that sort of answers your question a wee bit.
okay. Angus?
One for Mark or Colin, actually. Just on the Moray Firth tracking project, we've heard today that the fitness of smolts is important, but also the size. So is there a correlation to size to surviving smolt that made it past the arrays?
That sounds very much like a scientific question, so I'm going to wing that one straight to Colin.
Where is Colin?
As far as I'm aware, the work from Moray Firth hasn't got to that stage of analysing the data to see if there's a size issue with the ones that get down there. Certainly in other studies there is a fairly well-known association between smolt size and survival, but it isn't always the case. There's definitely some evidence that says that size is not an issue. So again, it's one of these examples of something we need to dig deeper into in terms of whether it is something that is a hugely important issue for marine survival. So hopefully we've got a lot of work to do with that data. As you heard, there's a huge, huge amount of it that's being trawled through at the moment.
Hi, I'm Guy Woodward from Imperial. I can add a few words to that. So I'm a freshwater ecologist, so I tend to look at the system as a whole, and the salmon being an important cog in a much bigger wheel. And what we see in aquatic food webs in general is they're very, very strongly size structured. So the position that an organism takes in that food web, irrespective of its identity, is strongly determined by its body size. Smaller things tend to have much stronger predation exerted upon them. So if smolts are getting out to sea smaller, potentially they are more vulnerable to everything else in the food web around them.
Thank you.
Peter Williams mentioned that there had been egg planting in parts of a river where there were not naturally salmon. I'm a little confused about the ethics of protecting the natural balance as opposed to manipulating the natural balance.
Do you want Peter to answer that, or you, Mark?
I think we can pass that one to yourself, David.
I'm going to answer this. I think it's a very fair question, and I certainly don't think I'm going to come down on one side or the other. There is, as you know, a very good reason to open up parts of the rivers that have formerly been closed or been recently closed through dams and barriers. And so you could argue that opening up a natural piece of river to salmon was an arguably acceptable thing to do. But I'm not going to get into a debate about that.
Can I just come in?
Please do. You comment.
in Iceland to make sure that, for example, we know that you can't continue doing that forever, we know that you can't do too much of it and so on, and we know that we have to carefully manage how we perform that. And that, as I say, is all with the authorities in terms of overseeing that process. So understand the question. I think it's a good question. It's a valid question. Hopefully we're on the answer to the question. We're addressing the question in the way we're approaching this.
Can I just come in briefly there, Mr. Chairman, and say that the Alliance is about the protection and conservation of wild Atlantic salmon. And there, as we know, Iceland are famous for stocking sterile rivers for angling, and that works. But angling, certainly from salmon and trout conservation's point of view, and I think I speak for everybody, angling is a dividend that comes on the back of healthy environments and healthy fish stocks. But if you don't have that, you don't have healthy angling, okay? But what we're doing with the Alliance is not just about angling. It is protecting and conserving wild Atlantic salmon. And if we get that right, angling is a very important, economically important, socially important dividend that comes on the back of it.
Sorry, could I just make one more comment for clarity as well after your comment there? Yes, I agree about the dividend, by the way. But just to be absolutely clear, the egg planting we're doing is not in the way historically sometimes it's been done with eggs from elsewhere. They are the salmon who populate the river. We're using the salmon who populate the river in a very carefully managed way. So just to emphasize that, these are the indigenous salmon from that river. We're not crossing river boundaries, we're using the river itself.
And I think you said they were actually the fit and proper salmon because they just come back that year.
They are, and they go off and swim again.
Yeah. Any other questions over there?
We're obviously in a period where the legislative framework for environmental laws in this country are somewhat in flux. Could you talk a little bit about campaigning priorities for that?
Yes, just following up on some of the things that Bill said. So if we look ahead for the next sort of 12 to 24 months, we're in a key position where a number of different pieces of legislation at the UK level and a number of pieces of regulation and movements at the Scottish government level with the Scottish elections in 2021 as well, are really going to frame the way we're able to deliver the urgent action that's required. Not only the action that will come out of the Likely Suspects project, but also the actions that Bill has already alluded to. So if we look ahead, if whatever the new government will be, and whatever happens with the B word, which I won't mention, we are going to have to look at issues around the new agricultural bill that's proposed, the new environment bill, the fisheries bill for all the impacts in the marine environment, plus the issues around a comprehensive spending review and the funding that our regulators and agencies need in order to provide and deliver the regulation and monitor and enforce that regulation. So there's a clear, really urgent and important challenge to get that sort of framework in the right place, that as the knowledge from the Likely Suspects project comes through and the other projects you've heard about, it has a place to land, it converts that knowledge into action that delivers the change we need to see for the Atlantic salmon.
Any other questions? Oh, yes, right at the back on the right, or there are two there. Actually, I think we've got a great opportunity in a sense because there's so much flux in regulation in prospect.
Thank you. I think we all know that aquaculture is here to stay. I'm just wondering at what level we should be pushing land-based aquaculture more, because that surely offers a very good sustainable option.
Yeah, it's a really good question, thanks. And the first thing to say is certainly nobody in the Alliance is looking for salmon farming to be abolished. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea anyway. But some people have suggested that over the years. But what we're saying is it has to be sustainable. And it's not up to us to tell farmers how to farm. What we are looking for is a biological and a physical barrier between wild and farm fish. Now, we believe the best way of doing that is closed containment. Land-based, yes, although that has its issues, where you can do it. There are ways you can have a more than a halfway house. Actually, you can put tanks, closed-contained tanks, in situ where the cages are at the moment. And there's a lot more infrastructure. It's more expensive. But the costs are becoming very comparable now, and we believe that closed containment, whether it's in the sea or whether it's on land, is the way forward. But I must reiterate, nobody wants to see the back of fish farming, quite far from it, but we do want to see it environmentally sustainable, and we believe that that's the best way of doing it.
Hi, it's Alistair Maltby from the Rivers Trust. I've got a sort of two-part question. It's been an inspiring and thought-provoking morning. My first question was, how do you plan to urgently translate the findings of the research into management recommendations and help to achieve these at scale on the ground? And the second part, which is really coming from our particular Rivers Trust experience, is if we're going to make these changes at scale, we're going to have to challenge wider society on flood risk, on aquaculture, on water bills and the way we manage our drinking water, on farming, on the way we manage other parts of nature in our environment. Yet, when I look around us, we're a very limited part of society, and I think, just how inequitable it is for us to get the opportunity this side of the Atlantic to catch salmon and be inspired in the way that Tom, myself, Dylan, I'm sure everyone in this room is. Unlike perhaps the Pacific Northwest. And at some point, I think it's not just salmon that's missing in this alliance, it's also people. How do we get the missing people involved in this who can help us to change society on a bigger level?
You're absolutely right. The research in itself is not the end point, and we have to take the research into what I call the 3 Ps So policy, better practice and public awareness. And until we've done that, we're not delivering the outcomes that this alliance needs to produce. We do face a very new legislative framework, particularly at Westminster following the election. As Stuart has said, we'll have a new agriculture bill and a new environment bill. It is perhaps disappointing that DEFRA's much vaunted 25-year environment plan, if you do a word search, doesn't actually have the word fish in it. So I think we do have quite a lot of work to do to get this stuff into policy. You also talked about the specific, which I can't answer, but I don't know if any of our speakers want to contribute to that.
Very good. Any last question? Right, last question. You're going to need a mic, aren't you? Sorry.
There's two things I'm surprised at that weren't mentioned today. Quite minor things, but both to do with the amount of salmon in the rivers. I was told some 40 years ago by a very eminent gentleman at the time that one of the biggest problems in the Tay was the amount of grilse returning. And without the commercial catch there at the time, which was vast, and I was more than partly involved in, they were filling up all the tributaries in their breeding and stopping the more than year-old salmon from breeding, which was contributing at the time to the decline in the larger number of very large fish that used to come from the Tay. Grilse, of course, I was told at the time, were sexually precocious salmon. Excuse me. I switched it off, I thought.
That's a big donation to the Alliance, by the way.
It was grilse, of course, being a sexually precocious salmon that always returned to the river at the end of the first year, as I was informed by this gentleman. They haven't been mentioned at all today, and yet only salmon have been talked about. The other problem, of course, is that in 1980 I was quite heavily involved in a very large survey that was carried out partly by National Geographic into the seal population off the northeast coast of England when netting was in free flow at the time. And they reckoned, by the sort of farmers type count, that there were approximately 34,000 indigenous seals off the northeast coast of England, southern Scotland. That number rose in a similar survey in 2000 to 390,000. My latest figures that I understand, but not verified, are well in excess of 400,000. And yet seals haven't been mentioned as a predator today. And yet they're regularly shot by farm salmon people. And it is not illegal to actually culve seals in England. I just wonder what the thoughts are of the powers that be on those.
I think I will summarise it because this highlights exactly why we need the likely suspects framework. There are so many different pressures on salmon, grilse, sea trout that we really need to be able to find out which are the pertinent ones. Where do we need to invest in the 3 Ps so that we can do our best to target our resources to turn around the decline in salmon? And at the moment we have a pile of suspects, pressures, threats to these fish, and it's this high and it's growing every day, and the size of those threats is perhaps growing every day. And what we need to do is act like a casualty department, triage them and find out where to invest and get on with it.